Let's go then to the next guest. Then we're speaking to Equal Education to get some reaction from the unions via Zoom. We're joined by Hopolang Selebalo. A very good afternoon to you, Selebalo. Thank you so very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Good afternoon, Flo. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for agreeing to speak to us. I read a statement, of course, by Equal Education, and you've said that the last year's academic calendar emphasized several inequality gaps in the sector. Let's please speak to those. I mean, every time that I have spoken to Equal Education, you've raised a number of pertinent issues. Some of them even being the issue of feeding schemes at schools, and I suppose that adds to some of the concerns that you've had throughout 2020. You've been quite consistent in your messaging around the inequality gaps in the sector, and I'd like you to speak to those for us. And on the back of that, and I apologize for making this a long question, but I was speaking to Professor Letseka from UNISA, and I was looking at the IEP results, which are sitting at 98.7%, and then the government schools, what's called the government schools, which are sitting at 76.2%, and I think that's quite a gap. And then I thought of the issue of inequality yet again, and as I speak to you, I speak on the back of that too. So if you can speak to us on this issue of the inequality gaps in the sector that you speak of.
I guess maybe one just should start off by congratulating the class of 2020. As you've pointed out, Flo, it was an incredibly difficult year, and we want to commend learners and teachers for managing to get through such a difficult year. And as you highlight, the pass rate has decreased by 5%, and this was brought on by existing inequalities within the education system and the various disruptions that came through last year. And as you point out in our statement, we highlight a number of factors that really affected the system as a whole, but matric learners in particular. And that was the prolonged closing of schools between March and June last year, and then again between July and early August. The grade 12s had to cover the full curriculum, so there was no movement there in terms of trimming the curriculum. And then at the end of the year, there were the matric paper leaks, and there was the possibility of learners having to rewrite. So the odds were very much stacked against last year's matriculants. And the inequality that we speak about, or the issues that we highlight, pertained to the access to resources that learners were able to get during that period of time. Many of the learners that are part of Equal Education, our equalizers, spoke about how they struggled to get access to textbooks during that prolonged school closure, or access to workbooks during that prolonged school closure. And I remember when the minister initially closed schools, Gadi 18's March, she had said, we're going to provide learners with workbooks. But then in a later interview, a couple of weeks later, she herself said she wasn't sure whether these workbooks were provided to learners. And learners were obviously struggling to access teachers. And then when it comes to ICT, we know that's a mess. I mean, we have schools that are still struggling with access to electricity as we speak, never mind the internet. So that kind of relationship between teachers and learners, particularly in under-resourced schools, was broken. And I know that teachers tried really hard, and learners tried really hard by having study groups via WhatsApp and the like. But there wasn't, for many schools and for many learners, there weren't any Zoom classes happening between between March and June. There weren't any Zoom classes happening when schools couldn't reopen because they weren't able to comply with COVID protocols. And then just on your point about private schools, I mean, private schools make a negligible amount of schools in the country, but as you point out, the decrease in the pass rate is minuscule compared to this bigger decrease in government schools. And that's because public schools could continue with their education. They're resourced. They were having Zoom lessons and Microsoft Team lessons. And while public schools were closed and private schools were open. And you might note that private schools actually opened earlier this year
Correct.
than public schools.
You know, Hopolang, yesterday as I was listening to the DG of the Department of Basic Education on the back of the announcement of the overall pass rate, he mentioned that, you know, they were able to stabilize schools, the schooling environment under very difficult circumstances. Would you challenge that? I mean, he was speaking on the back of this 76.2% pass rate, that it is good considering that they were expecting worse, and I'm sure you even heard the minister saying that she was expecting a bloodbath. So on the back of that, he said that they managed to stabilize the schooling environment. I suppose you would then be challenging that.
I think that's a great question. What played out last year, in my view, or in our view, is comes on the back of history, comes at the back of things that were not fixed or issues that were not addressed previously. It didn't, you know, people talk about COVID did not illuminate inequality within the education system or inequality in this country, but inequality in the education system, it just, you know, it was always there. That inequality was there. It simply amplified it. The situation was desperate, and the system wasn't able to deal with the issues that it was confronted with. So in terms of the DG saying, you know, they were able to kind of mitigate against these factors that compromised learners' education. We fought very hard for the norms and standards for school infrastructure as EE. We've been fighting for them since before 2013. They were promulgated in 2013, almost a decade ago. You're supposed to have access to adequate and safe and dignified toilets, access to water, enough classrooms, schools that are not made of inappropriate material. But we're still confronted with the same challenges to this day, even though these were supposed to have been addressed a while ago. So when a crisis like this happens, we aren't buffered to deal with it. I mean, the department certainly moved quicker than it has in many years when it comes to dealing with like infrastructure backlogs. I will give it that. Yeah. But these were issues that were supposed to have been addressed a long time ago, and it didn't have to come to this, is the point that I am trying to make.
Hopolang, it's always a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you very much for giving us your input as usual. And we'll certainly be continuing conversations with equal education as the year progresses, as we are indeed still in this pandemic. No doubt those inequalities will continue to be highlighted this year. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
All right.